All right, if you have your Bibles, and let's go to the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 17. 1 Samuel 17 is where we're going to be at tonight. And you may have seen things like this online. In fact, if you spend any time online, I'm sure you have. And even if you don't, you've been in rooms, in businesses and such, where they'll have motivational posters on the wall. And then that was big at one point, and then it kind of turned into, as social media got going, posting motivational quotes about hustling and, living the entrepreneur life, etc. And so there's all these quotes that are meant to give us motivation. Like this one from Zig Ziglar: you don't have to be great to start, but you have to start to be great. Or the one from Wayne Gretzky: you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Which that image that I put up there cracks me up, because Wayne Gretzky's a hockey player, not basketball. But I guess it applies in basketball too. Henry Ford: when you think, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. So these motivational kind of things that, you see posted and you go, oh, that's good. The problem with finding motivation in those things is they don't sustain it. It's not sustainable motivation. It may give you a little tidbit that you can use in the moment, but it's not going to sustain it over the long term. And if you're not careful, like me, then motivational quotes and inspiration is actually a rabbit hole. When I'm getting ready for a new series and I'm picking out the graphics, like I did for this one, for the series Rise and Fall through Samuel, I can easily spend hours looking for just that perfect graphic, where if I'd have just worked at it and done it myself and done the work, then I wouldn't have needed that inspiration or that motivation. Well, our text this evening in 1 Samuel chapter 17 is one of these stories that's kind of used in that inspirational, motivational way. And it's the story of David and Goliath. We're finally there to, by far, the most popular story in the book of 1 Samuel, and really one of the most popular stories of all time. I mean, if you grew up in church and Sunday school at all, you may remember this story as one of the very first ones that you remember knowing from the Bible. You probably remember the characters on a flannel graph or in coloring books, or maybe the VeggieTales version. But even outside the faith, people know about the story. So much so that it's become like a phrase that people use anytime there's an underdog, that's going up against someone much more powerful, a sports team. Like, do you believe in miracles? Yes. Al Michaels, classic, another hockey reference, his classic thing when America beat the Russians. It was an underdog story. It was a David and Goliath story, and you hear that used all the time. This last week in the political realm, I'm sure it was used to describe someone who wasn't expected to win, but then did. Now, the danger in knowing a story so well, at least so we think, there's the danger. We think we know the story so well. David kills Goliath, yeah. But there's so much more to this story than just this underdog, this runt of the family, like we looked at last week, defeats this giant. It's much, much more than that. In fact, we'll see as we go along here that this is a long chapter, and the actual battle that happens takes about 2 verses. So it's really all about what's going on around the battle and why this battle even happened in the first place. And so I've prayed tonight, and I pray that you'll pray along with me, that the Spirit would give us fresh eyes and fresh ears to hear His word tonight. So we start off with the Philistines that are getting ready to attack Israel. The Philistines are at it again, like we've seen over and over in the book of 1 Samuel. And this time they're lined up in this valley called the Valley of Elah. And here's a couple of photos that you can see kind of what this valley looked. And the Israelites are on one side, and on the other side are the Philistines. And out comes a giant. It says, then a champion named Goliath from Gath came out from the Philistine camp. He was 9 feet 9 inches tall and wore a bronze helmet and bronze scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. There was a bronze armor on his shins, and a bronze javelin was slung between his shoulders. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and the iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. In addition, a shield bearer was walking in front of him. He stood and shouted to the Israelite battle formations, "Why do you come out to line up in battle formation?" he asked them. Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose one of your men and have him come down against me. If he wins in a fight against me and kills me, we will be your servants. But if I win against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us. Then the Philistine said, I defy the ranks of Israel today. Send me a man so we can fight each other. And when Saul and all Israel heard these words from the Philistine, they lost their courage and was terrified. So he challenges them, this giant, by the way, 6 cubits and a span. That's actually what the text says. It's around 9 feet, 9 inches that it says there. But all the manuscripts don't actually agree. It could actually be 4 cubits and a span. But either way, this is a giant of a guy. He's either 9'6" or 6'9", and the average male height in that day was around 5 feet. So he is a giant of a man, has a massive javelin, a massive sword. He's got his own armor bearer, shield bearer that's in front of him because his shield's so big and he's got so much gear on he can't even carry it all. That's pretty intense when you need somebody just to carry your shield. He's a giant of a man, and he is an evil man, and he challenges Israel by a war of proxy, sort of. One guy to represent you, one guy to represent me. I guess is a much more efficient way to do war. Whichever one wins, they will be the servant of the other. And we learned down in verse 16 that every morning and evening for 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand. So 40 days, twice a day, so 80 times, this Philistine comes out and challenges the Israelites in the valley of Elah, and every time they run away with their tails tucked, scared as can be. And then the story switches in verse 20, or excuse me, a little bit before that. It switches and it starts to talk about David, who's back home in Bethlehem. Remember, we met David for the first time last week when he was anointed to be the new king over Israel, and then went back to tending his father's sheep. We said last week, if Frankfurt is West Frankfurt, where we're at here, is Ramah, where Samuel was, then Bethlehem is Marion, down south of here, about 11, 12 miles. Well, the battle in the valley of Elah is happening 12 miles west of there, okay? So Bethlehem is 12 miles to the east of where this is happening. And so we're cutting over to Marion from, around Crab Orchard, which is where that would be if you were putting it into our geography. We cut over to the scene there, and David's dad sends David out on an errand, essentially. So he says, find somebody else for the sheep, which David does. And he says, go take this bread and this cheese to your brothers and see how they're doing, because they're fighting. Well, they should have been fighting. They're with Saul as his soldiers. And so David does. He finds somebody to take care of the sheep, and he takes off early in the morning. Verse 20, David got up early in the morning, left the flock with someone to keep it, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had charged him. He arrived at the perimeter of the camp as the army was marching out to its battle formation, shouting their battle cry, which is absolutely ridiculous when you think about it, because they're not actually going to battle. It's been 40 days, over a month, and this Philistine comes out every day, challenges them, they run away, and then they come out and do it again. So they're doing the battle cry, but it couldn't have been very lively, because what difference does it make? They're not actually going to go fight. Israel and the Philistines lined up in battle formation, facing each other like they had been for the last little while. And while he was speaking with them, suddenly the champion named Goliath, the Philistine from Gath, came forward from the Philistine battle line and shouted his usual words, which David heard. When all the Israelite men saw Goliath, they retreated from him terrified. And so you have all of these soldiers, all of these manly men that look at Goliath and go, nope, I'm going the other direction. And then you have David, who sees things differently than the rest of them. Remember, we talked last week about the way that God sees and the way that people see. God sees at the heart while we just look at the outside. And while everybody else is worried about the outside of Goliath, because there's a lot of it, there's a lot of him. He is an intimidating warrior. David looks at the heart, and not just the heart of Goliath, but the heart of the matter. And he's indignant about what's going on. He says in verse 26, just who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Who does he think he is? Who does he think he is? That he can just come up here because he's not just defying Israel. He's not just mocking Israel. He's mocking Israel's God, the living God. And David says, who does he think he is? And his oldest brother, David's Eliab, that we saw last week, he isn't too thrilled, probably a little bit embarrassed by the questioning that David has here. Why do you come down here, he asked. Why did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your arrogance and your evil heart. You came down here to see the battle. Typical older brother, right? And he's one of the very few people in all of Israel who knows that David has been anointed to be king over Israel. And so he wants none of it because it's his baby brother, and he's just coming and embarrassing him, making him look bad in front of his buddies. And so he says, why don't you just go back to those few sheep? And David says, like, what did I do? What can I even say a word? And then he turns away and starts talking to the older brothers. And so when David says, I'll fight him. And so when David was overheard saying these things, and they reported it to Saul, and so he had David brought back with him, and David said to Saul, listen to this, don't let anyone be discouraged by him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine, which is absolutely crazy. Remember when we first met Saul in this book? He stands ahead above everybody else. He is the biggest, supposedly the baddest person in all of Israel. He would have been the logical one to go and fight Goliath, and yet he wants no part of it. And so he's excited when he hears that somebody is going to fight, but then he sees David. And he says, you can't go fight this Philistine. You're just a youth, and he's been a warrior since he was young. I mean, David, I love your attitude, and I wish I had, 1,000 soldiers with your kind of, gumption, but there's no way. You're going to get destroyed out there. And David answered Saul, and he said, your servant's been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear would come and carry off a lamb, I would run after it, strike it down, and rescue the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned on me, I'd grab it by the fur, and I would kill it with my bare hands. I've killed lions, I've killed bears, and he says, this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. You see the difference between these two guys? They see things differently. Where Saul is just looking at the battle, he's looking at this man, this giant that's in front of him. David sees what's really going on, which is he is defying the Lord of armies, the living God, and somebody needs to do something about that. And so then Saul says to David, without much more argument, go, and may the Lord be with you. How pathetic is that? That he is so easily convinced to let this teenager go out and fight this giant. And then he tries to put his own armor. He's one of the only couple of people that have armor in the Israelite army, and he tries to put it on David, but it doesn't work. And David says, I'm not used to this stuff. It doesn't fit. I can't do this with this stuff on. And so he takes the stuff off. Saul being Saul, trying to use human means to do what only God can do. And then you get to the action of the story. It says, instead, he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in the pouch in his shepherd's bag. Then with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. The Philistine came closer and closer to David with the shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him because he was just a youth, healthy and handsome. He said to David, am I a dog that you come against me with sticks? Well, you got your little shepherd's hook. You're like, what are you going to do, poke me? I heard one guy say this week, it's almost like he's saying, like, are you serious? This is the best you can send out? It's like sending Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory, to go fight Goliath. And then it says he cursed David by his gods. Come here, the Philistine called to David, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts. Now listen, he says he cursed him by his gods. Well, what gods would those be? Remember the Philistine god Dagon? Remember how when the ark came and that God fell down before the ark of the living God? The second time, his head broke off, his hands broke off. He has no mind, he has no will, he has no power. What's interesting is that Goliath, who's cursing David in the name of these gods, Dagon and the others, he's going to end up very quickly just like that god, Dagon. David said to the Philistine, here's the difference. You come against me with a sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the ranks of Israel. You have defied him. Today, the Lord will hand you over to me. Today, I'll strike you down, remove your head, and give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the wild creatures of the earth. Not bad. Trash talking for a beginner. I mean, David's got it down. Actually, sounds like him and his brothers probably trash talked a little bit. He says, no, you're coming against me with all of your equipment, all of your stuff that I don't have, but I'm coming against you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, and he will hand you to me today. And I'm not just going to feed you to the birds, I'm going to feed all of this whole camp of these soldiers to the birds. Why is he going to do that? What's the point? Well, it's right here in this last sentence before everything goes down. He says, then all the world will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. He will hand you over to us. That last sentence is the key to understanding this whole story. There are two audiences for this in David's mind. The whole world, first of all, every nation, including the Philistines, but especially the other ones, because there's not going to be any Philistines left if he has anything to do with it. They are going to know that there is a God in Israel. They're going to know that you don't go up against God's people and get away with it. And second audience is the people that are behind him, that have been waiting, scared, hiding out for the last 40 days, while this uncircumcised Philistine, in David's words, is making a mockery of God's people. He wants them to know that the Lord, he doesn't save with spear or sword, but by his own power. He and he alone will win the victory. And then you get to the battle. When the Philistine started to move forward to attack him, David ran quickly to the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and hit the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. It was the last thing to ever go through Goliath's mind. What is that? Oh, and there it is. David defeated the Philistine with a sling and a stone. David overpowered the Philistine and killed him without having a sword. And so David ran up and stood over him, grabbed the Philistine's sword, pulled it from a sheath, and used it to kill him. And then he cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they fled. I love that scene. You imagine David walking up cautiously at first, maybe to Goliath. And then when he gets up and sees that, he definitely hit him, then he reaches down and said, excuse me, could I just borrow this sword for a second? I won't need it for very long. Doesn't really look like you're going to be using it anyway. Thanks. And proceeds to chop off his head. What a story. This underdog story, because it is that, but it is so much more. What's the point of the story? I mean, is it like what you hear, like, you know, the bigger they are, the harder they fall? Is it that underdogs have this sort of creative advantage? That's what Malcolm Gladwell wrote in his book called David and Goliath about this. About this story, that he, you know, basically that the underdog has actually an advantage because they're they're freer and more creative and have the urgency that big companies don't have. Is that what the point of it is? Or maybe the Christian version of that, which is if you trust God and give him your concerns, then he will give you the victory over the giants in your life. Whether it's that girl that's being mean to you at school, or your marriage, or infertility, or your job, or whatever the case may be, you just trust God, you follow him, and he will slay your giants. You will have the victory over that. Probably the worst example of this I saw even this week was this quote from Toby Mack from DC Talk this week. He said, "Sometimes God will put a Goliath in your life for you to find a David within you." Oh, isn't that sweet? No, it's not sweet. It's completely missing the point. And if David were standing here right now, he would say that is the opposite of what that story is all about. The point of the story is the battle is the Lord's. The battle belongs to the Lord, and the Lord alone is the one who could fight the battle, and he did. See, when we think about David, one of the reasons that I wanted to do this series in Samuel is because understanding David, this central character in the Bible, opens up so much about who Jesus was. The New Testament, what are the first words in the New Testament? This is the story of Jesus Christ, son of David. Clearly, David's story has a big part to play in our understanding of the gospel story that we're getting ready to celebrate even as we come up to Advent in a couple weeks. Jesus, when we look at David, we always need to be looking for Jesus. Whenever we look in the Old Testament and the New, we need to be looking for Jesus. Jesus told his disciples before he left that the whole of the scriptures, and he's meaning the Old Testament because there wasn't any new yet, they point to him. They're about him. And the son of David is really the one who this story was about, because he is the one who came and defeated our giants for us. He is the one who won the victory for us. Almost 1,000 years later from David's time, over there in Marion, in Bethlehem, another little baby would be born. And it turns out his father was also sending him on a mission to a battlefield as well. And Jesus entered the fray, entered this battle as our representative to do battle with our enemy, the giant that was way too big and way too menacing for any of us to do anything about ourselves. Satan, our Goliath, he despises us. He despises you. Did you know that? Because you're his. And even if you're not a Christ follower, you remind him of God because you're made in his image. And so the devil, our giant, he mocks the name and the glory of our God as he roams around the battlefield of this earth, which is territory that he's occupying, just like the Philistines were, but does not belong to him. And day and night, he's pacing back and forth like a lion, seeing who he can prey on, who he can pounce on, who he can destroy. He says, "Come out and fight me, and if you win, I'll be your slave." Kind of the devil went down to Georgia idea. Like if I'm better than you, then I'll give you whatever it is, golden fiddle. But if I'm better than you, then I'll take your soul. And it never works out. Despite what that song says, it almost never works out in our favor. The only way it does, because the only one that can defeat the giant was Jesus. And so Jesus comes in our place as our representative, as our substitute, and he lives the life that we could not live. He fights the battle that we could not live. You imagine what you would feel if you were going up against some black ops, special forces that were coming after you tonight and said, "We're going to feed you to the birds." I don't care how much ammo you've got in your house, how many guns you have in your safe. You're not going to do much against these well-trained, ultra talented veterans. And that's what Goliath was. And that's what our enemy is. He's got thousands of years of combat experience against believers, against the people of God. And he's got the heavy weapons of our guilt and our shame and our sin and how easily tempted we are and how easily we can be led astray. But even worse than that, he has the worst weapon of all, the sharpest, the most painful, the most devastating sword of all time, which is death. And he looks down, Satan, at your warm, cozy, probably fully stocked or close to it kitchen. Maybe this morning you were sipping on a cup of coffee or tea because it's cold outside now, with your hands around a mug. And I don't know, I'm just guessing here, but I'll bet you that somewhere, for sure in the world, but maybe even somebody listening tonight might have a cup that says, "Not today, Satan." And the devil sneers just like Goliath at that. What am I? An annoying coworker that you come at me with snark? Please, by all means, bring it on. And I'll show you right now who's got the upper hand. I'll feed you to the birds that you're watching out on your porch. The devil laughs at our war cries, just like Goliath did about day 35 of the war cries of Israel when they're not coming out. Because our war cries a lot of the time are exactly like Israel, just noise. He knows that there's nothing behind it because we can't do anything to stop him on our own. Do you see why this point, the point of this story cannot possibly be buck up? You need to be more like David. Think like David did. He faced his giants. Be more like David. No, we're not David in the story. When you're reading a story, whether it's God's word or just in general, we always tend to identify with someone in the story. The problem is when you get that person wrong. Now, we should try to emulate David's faith. But that is not the primary point of this story. And the primary application of this story is we are the Israelites. We are those people that are looking at the giant and going, I don't know about you, I'm not going to try to take him on. We're standing on the sidelines, shaking in our combat boots, unable to do anything but run in the opposite direction. The answer to Israel's problem and the answer to the problem of your giants in your life and mine is not another pump-up speech and not another motivational quote like we were talking about earlier. If those were going to do any good, don't you think they would have worked by now? David doesn't come onto the scene from Bethlehem to help the soldiers believe in themselves more. Oh, come on, guys, you can do it. Israel's number one. No, when God wanted to rescue his people, he wanted to put a stop to being mocked by this Philistine, he didn't send a cheerleader. He sent a substitute. His father sent him on a mission, starting from Bethlehem. He spent years in a menial job in a small town in the middle of nowhere where only the people that were right around him would even know his name. Even though he had been anointed, he had been the anointed one, that he was going to be king, just like David. He withstood the rejection of his own family, just like David. Jesus knew what it was like to be afraid, just like David did. I'm sure there was a little bit of anxiousness. His blood pressure was going up a little bit as he sees that Philistine coming towards him. And Jesus, when he saw the cross coming towards him, when he knew that the Judas was coming with his mob in just a few hours, he was to the point where there was blood mixed in with the sweat and the tears as he prayed. And yet he got to the point of not my will, but yours be done. I'll fight this battle and I will win. Except that Jesus didn't just risk his life like David did. No, he lost his life. But in the grandest, most amazing twist of all twists, it was actually for the victory that he died. Look at Hebrews chapter 2. Now, since the children have flesh and blood in common, that's us, we all have flesh and blood. But the Son of God, eternally existing before, did not until that night in Bethlehem. Jesus also shared in these so that through his death, he might destroy the one that's holding the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who were held in slavery all their lives by the fear of death. See, when David hit Goliath with that stone, then he walked up and used his own weapon against him and killed him. And Jesus, when he went to the cross, He used Satan's own weapon against him. He defeated death by dying himself and then rising from the grave on that third day. When he got up and he walked out of that tomb, he was essentially, metaphorically, holding the devil's head in his hands as he walked out. He said, "The victory is mine. The battle is the Lord's, and I am the Lord." I am the Lord. So, you may have heard some of those same kind of like, oh, you got to find the David within you. You've got to face your giants. You got to face your fears, and you need David's example for you to do that. You should try to follow David's example. But that's secondary to understanding that David was the substitute for these people. He fought their battle and won. And Jesus fought our ultimate battle, and he won. The victory comes for us after, as we follow him into the battle, knowing that we've already won. Look at the last part of this chapter. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they fled. The men of Israel and Judah rallied, shouting their battle cry, except this time it actually means something. I'll bet you that it was a lot stronger and a lot more powerful and a lot louder than it was that first time when David walked in and they're like, let's go for the 41st day and go walk over and hear him insult us. But this time, they let out that battle cry and they got after it. They chased the Philistines to the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. Philistine bodies were strewn all along the Sharim road to Gath and to Ekron. When the Israelites returned from the pursuit of the Philistines, they plundered their camps. So the victory that we have, if we're Israel in the story, there is victory for us. I'm not saying that this story is not about our victory. Oh, it is, but it's our victory following the one who actually won the battle for us. Jesus took away the danger of the battle. Just like David defeated the giant, and now they can just go full tilt after the Philistines. God has defeated our greatest enemy, sin, Satan, and ultimately death itself. And so because of that, we can go with full confidence, full steam ahead, fighting the battles for the kingdom of God that we fight, knowing that we already have the victory because somebody else won it for us. And his name is Jesus, the Son of David. So practically, how should the story of David and Goliath and the victory and Israel's victory afterwards, how should that affect the way that we live? Well, if Jesus took away the danger, there's no more risk for us as believers. You kill me? Fine. I get to go be with Jesus. That'll be even better. To die is gain, Paul said. Oh, you're not going to kill me? You're going to let me live? To live is Christ, right? There's nothing that anybody could ever do to us, ultimately, because Jesus has already won the victory for us. And we know that that is secure, which gives us the security then to fight our battles, the ones that he's called us to fight, with confidence, with this solid bedrock foundation that the victory has already been won for you and for me. So whatever that giant is, because when you hear this story, a lot of the times people are saying, what are your giants? What are those things that seem insurmountable in your life? What are those things that make you fear, where you see it in the distance and you want to tuck your tail and run in the opposite direction? I promise you that if you look closely enough at the life and death and burial and resurrection and ascension and return of Jesus Christ, you will find that it takes the sting out of whatever might happen. We have the victory because Jesus has the victory already won for us. Listen, we have the victory because Jesus won it for us. And what does that mean for the church? Well, it means, fear not, little flock, for it's the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. You know what else he says? The gates of hell will not prevail against it. Why? Because the victory's already been won. By the way, gates are not an offensive weapon. They're defensive. We're the ones with his power, with his strength, with his authority, because he said, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. Now go. Go with my authority and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe everything that I have commanded you. Make more disciples. That's our ultimate battle here, is to make disciples of all nations, of our families, of our friends, of anybody that we can bring people in whatever stage of life, whatever stage of faith they're in, to bring them closer to following Jesus. That is our mission. That is our aim. And we know that we have the victory. And so we can sing songs like stand up for Jesus, from victory unto victory. His army shall he lead, till every foe is vanquished, and Christ is Lord indeed. Oh, church, arise. That's the song that we're going to end with tonight. Oh, church, arise and put your armor on. Here's a call of Christ our captain. He's already won the battle, and so we follow after him into battle because we know that the battle actually belongs to the Lord. With a sword that makes the wounded whole, we will fight with faith and valor. You know why? Because when trials are on every side, we know that the outcome is secure, and Christ, our substitute, will have the price for which he died, an inheritance of nations. All the world will know that there is a God in Israel. That's the main point of the story. And the other part is so that we, his people, would know that the Lord, he doesn't give us salvation, doesn't give us the victory by sword or by spear. No, the battle is the Lord's. And so, because that's true and because we know he's good, let's follow after him and fight.